Sejam todos e todas bem-vindos ao nosso webinário do SubConst, é o terceiro webinário do segundo semestre de 2019. Nós tivemos na quarta-feira a professora Érica Arban, da Universidade de Melbourne. Nós tivemos há um mês atrás o professor Miguel Ángel Rodrigues Vasquez, do México, falando para nós, e hoje nós estamos com o professor André Lecours. É uma satisfação receber o professor André Lecours, ainda que à distância, no Brasil. Seja muito bem-vindo à Universidade Federal de Mato Grosso do Sul, ao Núcleo de Pesquisa em Subconstitucionalismo. O professor Lecours é professor titular da Escola de Estudos Políticos da Universidade de Ottawa, no Canadá, doutor em Ciência Política pela Universidade de Carleton, Ottawa, Canadá, mestre em Ciência Política pela Universidade de Laval, no Quebec, Canadá, graduado em Ciência Política pela mesma universidade. Já foi diretor associado e diretor estágios da Escola de Estudos Políticos da Universidade de Ottawa, foi diretor do programa de mestrado também da mesma universidade, professor associado do Departamento de Ciência Política da Universidade de Concórdia, Montreal, Quebec, Canadá, e vice-presidente da Associação Canadense de Ciência Política, além de ser autor e organizador de vários livros, capítulos e artigos, uma produção muito significativa, incluindo Basque Nationalism and Spanish State, Constitutional Politics in Multinational States, Nacionalismo e Proteção Social, e Fiscal Federalism and Equalization Policy em Canadá, entre outros. O professor Lecours vai proferir hoje uma palestra sobre o federalismo e a questão da secessão, que é um dos seus objetos de estudo. Então, agradeço a presença de todos e todas, e desde logo dou as boas-vindas ao professor André Lecours. Thank you so much, Professor. Please be our guest to talk, and thank you again for accepting the invitation. We know that we learn a lot with you today. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Fernando. I'm really happy to be able to speak to all of you. Maybe a couple of caveats or remarks before I start. So, of course, I'm a political scientist. I'm not a constitutionalist or legal scholar, but I being in the field of, federalism especially, I've worked with constitutionalists and legal scholars a lot. So I think it's very fertile to have cross-disciplinary conversations like these. And then my topic today is not directly, of course, on kind of sub-state constitutions, but it's really linked to federalism, to its potential limits for accommodation, and especially it's really about autonomy. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I think is important in terms of autonomy in federations that are multinational, in federations where there are nationalist movements struggling for either increased autonomy within the state or outright independence. So I might see if I can share a little PowerPoint here. Let me see.
Yes, it's in the 3 vertical points. You can click on them, and then
okay, it's in the vertical points. Yeah, okay.
Yes, and then share your screen. I'm sorry. It's the button on side, the presenting now. It's a square with
So I have let's see, a window. I don't know.
Choose a window or or your full screen. I think is a window.
Can you see something now or not?
No, I think is starting. No. So far, no.
How about here? Yeah, now I think you can see it. Right?
Okay. Yes.
So I put the cover of the talk really basically corresponds to a book which I published last year, and I called it Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy. And for me, it started with the puzzle, with something that I couldn't easily explain. And as someone who was interested in Spain for a long time, what surprised me was the what's called in Spain and in Catalonia, the Catalan process of self-determination, right? So in Catalonia, beginning in around 2012, there is a push for independence, for outright independence from Spain. This was surprising because historically, nationalism in Catalonia had been about acquiring more autonomy within Spain rather than seceding from Spain. And so, of course, I was also interested in Scotland. I had been in Scotland for the 2014 referendum on independence. So there were two cases here in the 2010s where nationalist movements in an advanced industrialized liberal democracy were struggling not for just increased autonomy or more redistribution within the state, but rather for independence. And this was surprising because I was formed as a scholar in the late 1990s and early 2000s, reading a literature essentially on globalization, European integration, and how these processes would render secessionist movements looking for outright independence from the state, basically obsolete, right? The idea expressed in this literature by Michael Keating and others was that as the world was getting more complicated, there were ways to accommodate nationalist movements in a way that they would not look for outright independence, but rather would be satisfied with significant or increased autonomy within the state. So why was it, I was wondering, that Catalonia and Scotland, at the time where it was not expected at all, were pushing for independence? So that was, to me, a puzzle that was a surprising outcome. Adding to that was the fact that in at least a third country that I knew quite well, in Belgium, also a country with a significant nationalist movement. So Belgium's divided between French speakers and Dutch speakers, essentially. And there was a Flemish movement in Dutch-speaking Belgium that had historical existence. But contrary to Catalonia and Scotland, it had remained primarily autonomous. It was not looking for independence, but had remained focused on protecting and promoting autonomy. And then back in 2017, I spent some time at a place that some of you might know, at URAC and the Institute for the Study of Federalism there in Bolzano. Some of you might know, I've read Francesco Palermo. And I was intrigued also by the situation of South Tyrol. So this community of primarily German speakers in the north of Italy, which historically had looked for reunification with Austria or independence, and sometimes violently, but which in the last several decades had settled, if you will, for managing its autonomy within Italy. So the situations in Flanders, in Belgium, and in South Tyrol in the north of Italy added to the puzzle, because then I had two cases of nationalist movements that were strongly secessionist, that looked for independence, and two other cases of nationalist movements that had remained autonomous and never, never fully developed into a strong secessionist movements, at least in the 2000 and 2010. So that's how I started with this book, trying to answer the question, what explains the strengthening of secessionism in liberal democracies? What explains why a couple of these movements became strongly secessionist while two others didn't? And as I'll show, as I'll explain soon, it has a lot to do with federalism and with autonomy. So that in the book, I do a comparison of pairs, right? On the one hand, Catalonia, and on the Catalonia and Scotland, and on the other hand, Flanders and South Tyrol. So the idea for me was to look at something that Catalonia and Scotland shared that was not shared by Flanders and South Tyrol. So with this kind of design for my comparison, there were quite a few explanations that could be rejected. If you look at Catalonia on its own, you know, a lot of people have written that maybe the Catalan turn towards secessionism was the result of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010. But that crisis also hit Italy, also hit Belgium, and it didn't have the same consequences for the nationalist movements there. So not a satisfying explanation, in my opinion. A lot of people wrote that, you know, it's part and parcel of this wave of populism. But again, there's populists in Italy, we know that, very strong populist parties, and in Belgium as well, as in Spain and the UK, and there's, you know, so there's populism everywhere, but I'm looking for a source for different outcomes here. So clearly it can't be populism. Then I looked at some other potential explanations in the literature. One that's often mentioned is the degree of autonomy. How much autonomy does, you know, a minority nation, the likes of Catalonia, Scotland, Flanders, South Tyrol, or Quebec in Canada, how much autonomy does it have? Well, when you look at the 4 cases for which that I included in my comparison, the level of autonomy, as best we can measure it, and it's hard, but there's something called the Regional Authority Index, designed by a few political scientists there, led by Lisbeth Huga, who suggests that, you know, quantifying autonomy, my 4 cases at about the same level of autonomy. So clearly, it's not about how much autonomy a minority nation or a minority national community has that will impact the extent to which it will look for independence, because my 4 cases all had the similar level of autonomy, and yet they moved in different directions, some looking more strongly towards achieving independence and others not. And finally, the design of autonomy was completely different as well, right? Spain is not a federation, but for all intents and purposes, it's a federal system. Belgium's a federation, for sure. The United Kingdom, well, is this kind of, there's devolution, there's decentralization, you know, and in Italy, of course, it's a different model of decentralization. So they're all different, right? But nothing there would explain why, you know, Scottish and Catalan nationalism behave the same, and that together they behave differently from nationalism in Flanders and in South Tyrol. So after I kind of couldn't find any good explanations in the literature, I started thinking about how to think about this. And the literature on secessionism, you know, what makes a nationalist movement become secessionist, it's often about kind of the intrinsic qualities of these communities, right? How different are they culturally? How wealthy or how poor are they in relation to the rest of the country? And again, I found these types of explanations pretty poor because they didn't work with my cases, essentially, right? So the way I really started thinking about that is, you know, maybe it's about the nature of the relationship between the minority national community and the state, right? Because when it comes to nationalism, one of the things we know about the literature is that nationalism and the state are closely connected, even if it's kind of a nationalist movement within the state that looks for either autonomy within the state or independence from the state. Its objectives, its dynamics is often conditioned by what kind of response it gets from the state, right? So using kind of a political science literature that's known as historical institutionalism, so the idea that, you know, political institutions are important and that, you know, the timing of institutional weight is also really important in shaping political outcomes. I developed what I think is an interesting, maybe conceptual innovation about autonomy, because I started thinking, if it's not how much autonomy a minority national community has, maybe it's about the extent to which autonomy evolves in time, right? So the basic idea here is that if a minority national community like Catalonia and Scotland are told by the state that their autonomy will not change, will not be adjusted to circumstances, then they are placed before a choice, right? A binary choice, which is accepting the status quo or seeking independence, since the state doesn't provide any room in between. So I kind of conceptualized static and dynamic autonomy. And I defined dynamic autonomy as an autonomy arrangement that can be either laterally adjusted, meaning adjustment might not involve an increase in autonomy, or an autonomy that's progressively enhanced in time. So in other words, I think we can see autonomy as potentially having a dynamic quality, subject to negotiation and renegotiation, or a static autonomy, which is an unchangeable autonomy arrangement, a kind of here's autonomy, take it or leave it. We're sticking with what we have, right? So I mean, of course, there's lots of different ways to adjust autonomy. It can be done constitutionally, but it can also be done kind of politically or administratively. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. So what I started thinking is that, as I said before, if autonomy is dynamic, it would involve self-determination options other than just independence in the status quo, in the form of increased or adjusted autonomy. So if autonomy is dynamic and you have more than two self-determination options, the likelihood is there'll be reduced support for secession, for looking for outright independence. If autonomy is static, then it places members of a minority nation before only two self-determination options. And one is independence, and the other one is the status quo. So static autonomy that's kind of a permanent settlement, generates incentives for supporting secessionism. So that's kind of what I started the research with, and I'll tell you a little bit about the cases, which I think provide support for these ideas. So essentially in Catalonia, my reading of the situation was that, Catalan autonomy had basically remained unchanged since the creation of the statute. There were negotiations for reforming the Catalan Statute of Autonomy. These negotiations, although there was a political agreement, eventually that agreement was put before the Spanish Constitutional Court, which struck down or narrowly interpreted a lot of the provisions, which to me kind of contributed to sending a strong signals to the Catalan political class that it would be very difficult. Was very improbable that Catalan autonomy could be reformed, could be adjusted, and that in fact Catalonia, what Catalonia had was, in my terms, static autonomy, right? Therefore, in a sense, telling the Catalan political class that either was the status quo and, well, independence, also impossible in the Spanish framework, but that there was no kind of middle option, right? I mean, Scotland is a little bit more complex because, of course, when the Scottish Parliament was reestablished in 1999, there was a settlement, a devolution settlement, which, as I argue, was meant to be permanent. Now, in Scotland, there were some discussions about improving Scottish autonomy, but they came too late. They came once the Scottish National Party had formed a majority government committed to holding a referendum on independence. And in addition to that, when the Scottish National Party had formed its government and began negotiating with the UK government on what such a referendum would look like, what type of questions could be asked, when the Scottish government suggested it could be a multi-option question, independence, more autonomy, the status quo, the United Kingdom government insisted that the question be simply on independence, yes or no. Why? Because the United Kingdom government believed, and probably it was right, that if the Scottish government asked a question that included three options, the middle option, increasing autonomy, would be the one that would win. And the United Kingdom government didn't want to have to increase Scotland's autonomy. It didn't want dynamic autonomy. It thought that it could win the referendum by forcing the Scottish government to ask a yes-no question on independence, which it did. But the irony is that towards the end of the campaign, as things got really close, British political parties committed to increasing Scotland's autonomy, and that was done. That was done thereafter. In Flanders, this is to me, a very clear case of the effect of dynamic autonomy. Of course, Flemings are a majority within Belgium, and the most striking thing about Belgium politically, among many striking things, I guess, is that it constantly changes its constitution. And these constitutional changes always involve adjusting and actually enhancing Flanders' autonomy. So in such a situation, if you're a Flemish nationalist, if you know that there's an adjustment to Flanders' autonomy coming very soon, because typically Belgium amends its constitution every decade or so, then why would you take the risk of supporting a more perilous, potentially unpredictable, maybe dangerous option like secessionism, when you can work to regularly kind of adjust your autonomy through constitutional negotiations? So that, Belgium to me was a very striking case of an autonomy that's dynamic. Now, it's dynamic to the point of bordering on instability, of course, for many different reasons. So I'm not saying I advocate, doing what Belgium does, but to me, the consequences are pretty clear. You have as much potential in Flanders to have a movement that seeks independence than you do in Catalonia and Scotland, but in Flanders, it doesn't do that. And the same is true in South Tyrol. So the German-speaking community of South Tyrol in the north of Italy once sought either independence or reunification with Austria, but after the Statute of Autonomy for South Tyrol was renegotiated, the commissions that were tasked to reform these statutes were kept in place to govern the autonomy of South Tyrol. So South Tyrol and the Italian state have a very interesting arrangement. There's a commission, a so-called Commission of Six, which features 3 representatives from South Tyrol and 3 from the Italian state, which together update, adjust, gradually in time, the Statute of Autonomy for South Tyrol. Therefore, keeping South Tyrol's autonomy on the move, right? So it's really a dynamic autonomy. Dynamic autonomy was even the slogan of the main party for South Tyrol's German speakers, right? So people know that South Tyrol's autonomy is regularly adjusted. So again, why would they look in this context for more hazardous political options? So from these cases, I put forth this theory of secessionism in one sentence, essentially kind of holds in one sentence. It's this idea that static autonomy stimulates secessionism while dynamic autonomy staves it off. So dynamic autonomy prevents. Preventing is a strong word, but kind of renders less likely strong secessionism. And again, the idea here is that static autonomy, because it doesn't adjust to changing circumstances, it pushes member of the minority community towards the only remaining self-determination option other than the status quo, and that's independence. So there's tension between an institutional order that is static and a social political order that is changing, and that tension that comes out in the form of secessionism. To the contrary, dynamic autonomy, an autonomy that adjusts and expands in time, keeps pace with the processes of change, right? In terms of identity and interest. And, it means that the institutional order of the state and of the minority nation remains congruent with its social political order. So, as citizens of a minority nation can expect their autonomy to adapt and to change, the incentives to support secession are considerably reduced. So there you have it. And in the conclusion, I wanted, some of the things that I talk about are, where does static and dynamic autonomy come from in the book, that is, right? Because part of it, there's agency, but it's facilitated by some other factors, right? South Tyrol is very small, is very peripheral to Italy. So it's kind of easy from a political and constitutional perspective to have this kind of, original arrangement because it doesn't bother the rest of the country too much. But I understand that having, dynamic autonomy in a place like Spain would mean that, Catalonia being a big part of the country in many different ways, that's a completely different enterprise. And one thing that I say as well, and a lot of politicians in Canada here have really disliked my book because they believe that dynamic autonomy involves just giving nationalist movements always what they want, and always decentralizing. And that's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm not advocating for constant decentralization. I recognize that at some point there's nothing left, but I think in many instances it's not about, again, how much autonomy, it's about how autonomy is deployed. So I do believe that the state has to remain flexible and consider autonomy to be something that's always to be negotiated, always to be discussed, never settled and never solved. And typically, politicians at the central federal level they don't want to do that. They prefer to think of this was a problem, we've settled it, now it's in the past, so we can look at, other quote unquote more important issues, whatever they are, the economy or social affairs. But I guess, and I'll finish with that, my argument is that in these types of multinational countries, like Spain, like the United Kingdom, like Belgium, certainly like my home, like Canada, I mean, first of all, you can never take the existence of the country for granted. We here in my home province of Quebec, you may know that in 1995, we had a referendum on independence, which produced a score of 49.4% for the yes side. So it came very close to 50%, with a voter turnout of 95%. 95%, amazing voter turnout. So there's countries like these whose existence you can't take for granted. And it's really up to politicians to kind of manage these countries to, to help support their very existence, I guess. And to me, that involves, engaging in a relationship that where things are always up for discussion, and where autonomy is not treated as a problem that it can be solved once and for all, because I don't think it can be. So I think I'll stop here, Fernando.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lecours. It's great to hear you about your interesting findings about the secessionist problems. And I was thinking while you were talking that Brazil is a static federalism, because the design of our federalism is basically the same that was established in 1988. That was our last constitution. And if we focus on the history, on the constitutional history of Brazil, it's the same arrangement from several constitutions that came before the current constitution. Well, then it's a problem, but because it's difficult to change the autonomy, to change the distribution of powers or authority made by the constitution. Our constitution is frequently reformed. Then we have so far in 3 decades, a little more than 3 decades of this last constitution, more than 100 amendments. Then it's a lot of amendments. But curiously, relatively few amendments have for object the distribution of competences. Then it changes another aspects, but not this one in particular, because I agree with you. I think that there is some kind of agency problem with the politicians and the question of the ultimate authority in several matters. Well, what we are talking early was about the pandemic and the effects, the pandemic of the autonomy of states and even municipalities in Brazil. And we feel that the Supreme Court ruled a major role, played a major role in this question, containing the federal government and assuring a little bit more autonomy for states and cities, counties.
Yeah.
But this is my question for you. In the judicial power, Supreme Courts and constitutional courts play not only the role of make the control of constitutionality of laws, for example, but also the arbitration or judge of federal conflicts. And then, what do you think about the role of the courts, and especially the Supreme Courts or the constitutional courts in this question? There are some evidence of important role.
Well, I think courts can certainly shape the nature of autonomy, right? I mean, in Spain, it's clear that the Spanish Constitutional Court, I guess I would say, has only one and a fairly clear vision of the country and its federal system, and it, to me, it interprets the Spanish Constitution in a way that really constrains options for reform. I can contrast that to the Supreme Court of Canada, which I think recognizes that the very nature of Canada is debated, that there is no agreement on the very nature of Canada, and therefore will typically refrain from weighing in on very kind of existential and political questions. And even when it has to arbitrate on a conflict about division of powers, to put it simply, will not always side with the central government. There's a colleague here from the University of Toronto, Robert Schertzer, who has written an excellent book a few years ago about the Supreme Court of Canada. I think it's called The Judicial Role in a Diverse Federation. The Judicial Role in a Diverse Federation. And that's one of the things he explains, that there's something very useful, if you will, about the Supreme Court of Canada, in that it has great legitimacy, in part because it can move between different visions of the country, right? Whereas I don't know the situation in Brazil, but you were kind of hinting, Fernando, that it at least in the pandemic, it sided with the states a little bit. In Spain, it tends to be the opposite. I think things are typically predictable. If there's a conflict about division of powers, it goes to the Spanish Constitutional Tribunal. I think we already know how it's going to end up, right? And that doesn't leave a lot of, I guess, fluidity or dynamism to the arrangement, right? Because then politicians say, well, that's the final word, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Professor. It's interesting because the Supreme Court, the Brazilian Supreme Court, traditionally has a centralizing conception, and for several decades, even before the current constitution, ruled, for example, that several federal models of organization of powers, of legislative procedures, for example, legislative procedures, for example, are mandatory for the states. Then the vision of the Supreme Court historically in Brazil is that the states have, in the most of matters, in the most of cases, to mimetize the federal institutions. It's a vision, very centralizing conception, very centralizing conception. But now in pandemics, we have, for the first time, or one of the few opportunities that the Supreme Court give more autonomy, has a conception less centralizing about the role in the autonomy of the states.
I mean, Fernando, I feel like asking you, because of course I'm a political scientist, right? So not sure I believe in the neutrality of law and court. So I'm wondering, was this an instance of the Brazilian Supreme Court taking in the whole global situation about the pandemic in Brazil and thinking that the right decision there was to give some empowerment to the states to kind of to act on behalf of their citizens through public health measures if they decided to do so, even though the federal government wasn't ready to do it?
Well, I think that it's always pragmatic reasons, for sure. I share with you, with the majority, I think, that of the politicians, of the political scientists, that is self-interested decisions that can explain better a lot of decisions, even of the courts. Then I think that the actual federal government, the current federal government in Brazil, that was elected in great part with the support of wide sectors of the judiciary, was perceived later was as a mistake. Then the same Supreme Court that validated some decisions of lower courts, that was evidently political decisions of a kind of lawfare that we have in Brazil in the past years, was object of several and virulent attacks from the president and the group of the fascist group that surrounds the president. Then I think that was a movement of self-preservation.
Yes,
Have a kind of fall of the rule of law in Brazil for several years, and then when the institutions, including the judicial power, suffered attacks and several attacks from the far right, then they reinstated a little more of rule of law in Brazil, and the federation in this process, but more strictly, more specifically, talking in which regard the COVID, the pandemic of COVID-19 and this infringement, because this government that was elected in large measure with the support of the judicial power was a great problem exactly in the moment of the pandemic. It's interesting. I think that here something that the political scientists know well. The democracy is a try and error process. We learn during the process. I think that the Supreme Court learned a lot in the past years. It's my impression.
Makes sense.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. I don't want to abuse of your generosity and your time. It was great to hear you and learn a little more about this. I expect that we have another opportunities to discuss, and I will reflect about your speech a lot, because I think that these two categories of static and dynamic federalism are very interesting to understand. And I think right now about the role of the judicial power too in this. In Brazil, traditionally, as I just said, the Supreme Court play the role of centralization, but I think that the opposite can be true in specific circumstances. Thank you so much, Professor.
Well, thank you for your invitation, and hopefully we can keep in touch.
Ok. Thank you. Bye.
Everybody.
Obrigado a todo mundo, gente. Eu já vou passar a lista para vocês aí no nosso chat. Vai, professor. Um minutinho só.